No man can serve two masters. This is according to the Gospel of St. Matthew. Some of these words are very apparent when you look at the problem that the Federal Reserve has in trying to achieve its dual mandate of controlling inflation and also promoting full employment. It wasn't always this case. Originally, the Fed was strictly in charge of the money supply and controlling inflation and so forth. In 1977, there was an amendment to the Federal Reserve Act which incorporated the dual mandate concept by adding low unemployment as also a concern of the Fed. And this was further emphasized in 1978 with the passage of the so-called Humphrey-Hopkins bill. And that bill also provided for the Fed to take into consideration unemployment as well as inflation. No man can serve two masters, and the Fed has had a hard time trying to achieve these two goals because they are not always consistent. Sometimes to fight inflation, you have to let go of the unemployment concern. And we have seen this in recent years. The Fed has been trying to do both and has not done either one very well. We're going to look today at how two Federal Reserve Chairmen, Paul Volcker and Jerome Powell, have tried to manage this dual mandate with different results, but both of them served under both Democrat and Republican presidents, and both of them had inflation problems. And we'll take a look at both of them here today and see what we can learn. Paul Volcker graduated from Princeton University and then went to Harvard to study economics at the graduate school. He had been an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And in 1979, Democrat President Jimmy Carter appointed Volcker to be chairman of the Federal Reserve at a time when inflation was really roaring in this country, double digits, I think nearly 13% as I recall. And Volcker came in and immediately went to work, reduced the money supply, brought inflation down. There were side events and consequences. There was a recession in 1982-83, but inflation was tamed. It came down and remained low. And in 1983, Republican President Reagan reappointed Volcker to the chairmanship of the Fed. And Volcker turned down the chance to be chairman for a third term in 1987. And his period of time there is known for its control of the money supply, bringing inflation down, and being focused on one item, and that was inflation. He didn't make any bones about the idea that when we're fighting inflation, we can't always necessarily keep unemployment down. And unemployment did go up some during the fight of inflation, but again, he was very clear that he had to have independence and to fight inflation, and that produced higher interest rates, and which of course raises the cost of borrowing and lowers housing development and so forth. But the results paid off. Well, Jerome Powell grew up in the D.C. area. He's a native of that area. Also went to Princeton University, as did Volcker. But graduate school was different. Jerome Powell went to Georgetown and got a law degree. So he is a lawyer by training. And he served in various capacities with banks and finance companies, and also did legal work, and was appointed to the Federal Reserve by Obama in 2012, and stayed on the Federal Reserve. And President Trump, Republican President Trump, appointed him chairman of the Federal Reserve in February of 2018. So remember that date, 2018. We're going to make a comparison between the CPI on that date and what it was, say, 7 years later. But at this point, it's good to recall some of what we have discussed earlier in these programs. For example, in July of this year, July 1st, 2025, I published a report on uh, what is economics. Economics is a social science, and I talked there about economics as a positive science of what is or tends to be. It's not a normative science or discipline of what ought to be. And the difference there is very clear when you contrast the approach of Volcker versus Powell. Now, Volcker was trained as an economist, and he knew that to fight inflation, you might have to give up on the fight temporarily for low unemployment. Powell, on the other hand, is trained as an attorney and talking and is concerned with balancing opposing forces and looking at the weight of the evidence. And we can see that in his remarks and in his behavior. Um, uh, we have to point out that law is a normative discipline. It is what ought to be. We have rules and statutes and constitution and so forth that attempt to establish norms of behavior. You have to pay your taxes, and you ought to pay your bills on time, and you ought to obey the speed limits and so forth. And so law is concerned with normative behavior. It's concerned with norms. And when Powell is discussing the Federal Reserve decision, whenever it is, he talks about the weight of the evidence, or in his case, the data points, and they're always waiting for the next rearview mirror to tell them where they are today. I've indicated in my previous reports that some of our data, particularly for the inflation data, I'm not convinced that it's as good as it should be. But the difference here in approaches is quite clear, because we have a decision-making process here that is trying to balance the two and is not doing either one very well. Well, a year or so after Jerome Powell became Federal Reserve Chairman, the Fed went into panic mode and increased the money supply significantly, and by an unparalleled amount. Over a 12-month period from December of 2019 to December of 2020, the money supply, as measured by M1, increased by 345%. Now, M1 is the narrower definition of money. It's basically currency in circulation and your money in your wallet, so to speak, and the balance in your checkbooks. And people have checks accounts at credit unions, commercial banks, and so forth. So wherever you have a checking account, the balance in that checking account is part of M1, and the money in the cash registers at stores or in your wallet, that's part of the money supply too. So when we say it increased, I've got charts here which are on the screen now, and they show a straight up increase in the money supply by, as I indicated, over 341%. If you go back a number of years, you'll never see any kind of an increase in the money supply like that. So is it any wonder that we had the inflation that we had? Remember, Milton Friedman says that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So if you increase the money supply like we did, the resulting inflation shouldn't be much of a surprise. Powell's lack of understanding of the situation was indicated in a number of instances. I guess the most notable one was when he said, well, inflation was going to be transitory. My friends, you will not find in any economics textbook a discussion of transitory inflation. Inflation is not transitory. It is here. It's part of the money supply. And if you're going to solve the inflation problem, you've got to go after the money supply problem and any other bottlenecks that might be into the supply chain of the economy. It's interesting, Black's Law Dictionary is a standard reference in a law library, and Black's Law Dictionary does have an entry about transitory. You will not find transitory inflation in an economics textbook. In my previous report, Money Matters Most, which was published in September 2nd, 2025, I have greater detail on the impact of the increase in the money supply, relationships to the national debt. So if you want to review and get a little more details of what happened during that period of time, I would call your attention to that report. But it was an unprecedented increase in the money supply, and our money supply is still elevated. Now they have drawn it down a little bit, but not near enough to really solve the problem of inflation. We have a 3% inflation. The goal is 2%, which hasn't been reached. Well, the following table shows a couple of more points that I want to stress to conclude today. Even if we succeeded getting a 2% inflation, prices will still double over your work life. For example, at a 2% rate of inflation, prices will double in 35 years. Think about that. If you're in your 20s or 30s, by the time you're going to retire, prices have doubled. But we are not at 2%. We're at 3% and have been 3%. And at 3%, prices double in 24 years. And bear in mind, after 24 years at 3%, they would double again. So over your work life, you could have a significant increase. And I think that we're doing a disservice to the younger generation by being complacent about the rate of inflation that we have, because the impact that this has on future prices is untenable. And in fact, look at the problem that young people have today in trying to buy a home. I saw a report recently where the average wage of a first-time home buyer now is like 40. I bought my first home when I was 26. So this is something to be concerned about. Also, I talked earlier about when Jerome Powell became Fed chairman in February 28, and I was going to look and see what has happened over 7 years. This screen shows that the consumer price index went from 248 to 319 over that period of time, a 3.6% average annual compound rate. Well, what can we conclude? It's clear that if you're going to fight inflation, you've got to fight inflation. And sometimes that means that you're going to have to tolerate some unemployment. And the problem is not insoluble. We can improve on unemployment benefits and other things to help people who become unemployed while we fight inflation. It's not as though we don't have remedies. We can, but we're going to have to recognize that no man can serve two masters. And it's very difficult for the Federal Reserve to try to carry out their dual mandate. Let me be clear. Mr. Powell, Chairman Powell, is an intelligent man. He is an educated man. He is sincere. But in my humble opinion, he's a misallocated resource. His brilliant training and mind from a legal point of view should be in some place like the Securities and Exchange Commission. There are plenty of opportunities to utilize a talent like that. Well, anyway, this is the Conk Economist helping you survive the waves of economic change, economic growth, economic development. Please subscribe.